Long Voyage Back, page 256. As the Bohemian launch withdrew toward the entrance to Marsh Harbour, Neil emerged from his cabin, ostentatiously wielding his pistol. The others soon joined him in the starboard cockpit next to Ollie at the wheel. "Well," Neil said, "we've just survived our first pirates." "Shall we go to Nassau?" Frank asked, shaking his head and pursing his lips in disgust. "We can't risk it, Frank," Neil replied. "It's still on to Puerto Rico." "We've only 20 gallons of fresh water," Frank said, startled. "If we go to Nassau, we'll never get out. They'll take our weapons, make us barter away our equipment for food, and all we'll get is extra water and 200 extra miles of fighting off pirates. It's not worth it." "But who knows if it's any better in the Virgins or Puerto Rico?" Tony asked, joining them. "Puerto Rico's a lot larger," Neil answered, "and they're both presumably more friendly to Americans." "Isn't there a chance Puerto Rico will have gotten involved in the war?" Jean asked. "We've got naval and air bases there, and we can sail to either of them from Nassau almost as easily as from here," Frank added. "Not if they've taken our weapons," Neil shot back tight-lipped. "We'd be sailing 1,000 miles through a sea of pirates, armed with Ollie's gaff and a boat hook. I'd prefer to die of thirst." Frank shook his head and paced into the wheelhouse and then turned around and came back. "In Puerto Rico he'd be a draft dodger and Jim a deserter," he reminded Neil. "In a war in which all the fighting will be over," Neil replied, "I doubt that by the time we get there anyone will care." "But can we go on much longer with so little food and water?" Jim broke in. "You told me yesterday we've got enough dried fish and water left for about only 3 days. Neil frowned, frustrated at facing 3 unacceptable alternatives. "I suppose we could try and sneak into one of the out-of-the-way cays," he mused aloud. "And if they catch us without clearance, they confiscate the boat," Frank said. "There's no way we should try that." "Can't we land on an island at night, get water, and get away before daybreak?" Jean suggested. "All the cays are buffered by reefs," Neil replied. "We can only get in and out by daylight, and we can only see the shoals and find the channels by daylight." "And we'd be spotted during the day," Frank added. "The Bohemians probably have air patrols as well as cutters." No one spoke. They seemed to have reached an impasse. Frank paced into the wheelhouse, this time sitting down when he got there. Jean looked at him, and then at Neil, finally Ollie, who stared forward, humming lightly to himself. "We should keep going," she said quietly. "God's put us in the middle of the biggest supermarket in creation, and if we can't learn to eat and drink what's out here, we don't deserve to live." When she stopped speaking, Frank ran his 2 hands through his thinning grey hair and stood up. He stared absently at Neil. "The West Indies," he said almost to himself. "Jesus, I bet by the time we get there, we'll decide we have to go to Brazil." He smiled mournfully at Jean. Neil moved for the first time since the discussion had begun. He lifted up one of the new water jugs. "I think we might begin planning on it," he said. "Well, Mac," said Tony a few hours later. He leaned over Conrad Macklin, who was sitting in the side cockpit at the trolling rig. "How do you feel about a captain's latest decision? You going to enjoy starving to death?" Macklin looked up at Tony neutrally, then idly tested the drag on the nylon line. "Yes, I am," he answered quietly. "You are?" "I enjoy starving," Macklin replied, which made Tony stare at him uncertainly, considering the alternatives. "I think we should try to dock in here and try to get some food." "Be patient, Tony," Macklin said, looking at him and smiling. "The thing you don't understand is that sometimes retreat and lying low are the best strategy. Our Loken's no fool. He's not afraid to do that." "Yeah, just like us, Tony," Macklin said, still smiling. "Just like us." And so they sailed on, past the white sand beaches and gleaming emerald sea of the eastern Bahamian Cays, and out to sea, to the east, having to make long tacks against the southeast wind while Neil wished it would shift, hoped he could guess which way it would shift, and sailing on, to either San Juan or the Virgin Islands, whichever the wind and the radio reports made a more feasible haven. And a new intensity took hold of the voyage. After their first escape from the mainland, a certain exhilaration and hopefulness had accompanied them southwards. They had food and water, and though both were rationed, it was something of a game, merely contingency planning. But now they had been turned away from a place they had seen as a source of supplies. Now they had been sailing almost a week without a landfall, and the contingency was upon them. There was no way to buy additional food, no sure way to get water. For at least another week the ocean was the only store in business and the skies the only source of water. Now they would sail successfully to Puerto Rico or the Virgins within 2 weeks, or perhaps die. Now the billowing white clouds that flowed lazily above them represented not beauty, but potential rainfall. The colour of a sunrise was watched for signs of an approaching low-pressure system that might mean rain, or a shift from the trade wind pattern they were heading into. Now fishing was as serious an undertaking as war, and when some huge fish snapped through the wire leader, took off with Jim's best lure and left them with only 3. He was as pale and shaken as if he had lost an important hill in a battle. Now they were out of the Gulf Stream. The fishing was much less dependable. In the first 5 days after picking up the Brumbergers, they caught only 2 fish. Now they began the monotonous, unpleasant, bone-jarring bashing to windward, sailing into seas, and the trade winds seemed to be building malevolently against them. Since it was his decision that they sail on past the Bahamas with insufficient food and water, Neil became obsessed with the struggle to sail Vagabond to windward as fast as possible. Although one of his basic sailing principles was never to criticise the wind, he found himself cursing quietly each time he awakened to find it still on their nose. He began to view the wind and waves as opponents he was fighting, an uncharacteristic attitude that he tried to check. When he observed Lisa's thinness, Frank's weakness, and recognised a certain lethargy in everyone's movements, including his own, this filled him with a rage to drive Vagabond eastward to a safe landfall where they could rest and eat and replenish their depleted stores. He searched out the boat for useless weight, as he might have searched for spies. Overboard went the portable television set, overboard some rusty chain, overboard 24 of the ship's trashy novels, old magazines, half-finished cans of paint, some junk wood, and 9 or 10 heavy bolts that might have been useful for something, though Frank had no idea what that could have been. They also discussed removing Vagabond's diesel engine, both to lighten the boat and to create a private berth at Ollie to ease the overcrowding. With Frank concurring, Neil decided that its future usefulness in a world almost devoid of fuel didn't match the burden of 600 pounds extra weight. In a 6-hour operation that involved all the men, Frank and Ollie supervised the unbolting and winching up of the heavy engine. By the time they were done, they had had to use half a dozen jury pulleys hanging from the main boom, wheelhouse roof and mizzenmast, when the engine, from which they had removed the alternator, finally rolled off the afterdeck into the sea. The men let loose a long cheer, and, dirty and sweaty, appropriated a beer each as their reward. It was the first successful mutiny on Vagabond, and Neil, clutching his own bottle, accepted it with a smile. The trimaran gained an inch on her waterline aft, and her trim was now much better. With the engine gone and no generator aboard, the batteries were unhooked from everything except the shortwave radio. Ollie and Jim began to develop a man-powered generator out of the diesel alternator, but with 3 batteries aboard, this project didn't seem pressing. However, after the camaraderie of removing the engine, the smashing to windward began to take its toll. They were all being weakened by the occasional seasickness and the scantiness of their diet. They were now primarily eating the fish steaks they had dried a week before. They opened 1 can of fruit a day for 10 people. They boiled or baked 2 potatoes a day. For liquids there was only occasional tea or powdered orange drink. Except for 1 6-pack they were saving for an appropriate occasion, the beer was gone. They drank water. The tensions among them were building. Everyone needed more privacy than was available, and for some the small ship had become a claustrophobic trap. Tony exploded at Neil for assigning equal rations to everyone, arguing that a big man like him needed twice the food that Lisa and Skip needed. Neil replied that Tony still had twice the body fat, and that until someone showed symptoms of malnutrition, the rations would remain the same. Both Tony and Macklin complained about sleeping in the forepeak, and Neil gave them permission to use his cabin or the dinette settee when either was free. Macklin complained continually of seasickness, but still somehow managed to eat his share of rations. Katia sometimes took his place as crew on Ollie's watch. When Jean reported that a can of peaches was missing, Neil did nothing, but when she reported that a small can of chicken spread had also disappeared, Neil laid down the law. If anyone was caught stealing food, he'd be put on half rations and abandoned at the first landfall. Tony got angry again because Neil seemed to be directing his remarks primarily at him and Macklin. Neil said the rule applied to everyone. Neil felt increasing irritation at such scenes, but he knew that if he could work things out with Frank and Jean, his other burdens would be more manageable. Although he and Frank treated each other with politeness, Frank's jealousy remained fierce. By words and glances he showed his anger or disapproval of any intimacy between them, while he self-showered Jean with attention. In the galley, helping with Skippy, inviting her to crew with him and Tony. Although Frank felt better than during the first 10 days, he was now keeping food down and showing more energy. He still looked sick, and Neil couldn't bring himself to do anything to hurt him. But his relations with Jean, already sobered by the deaths of the Brumbergers and the bypassing of the Bahamas, and dampened by his obsession with getting Vagabond east to a safe landfall, were further restricted by Frank's jealousy. Neil could feel a barrier going up between himself and Jean. He wanted to be with her, touch her, speak gently to her, but somehow such opportunities never seemed to arise. The first few times they'd managed to be alone had found Neil absorbed in some nautical problem and unprepared for intimacy, tongue-tied, abstracted. The claustrophobic mood of the boat affected everyone. Jim and Lisa, depressed by the invasion of their privacy by Tony and the Leas of Macklin, withdrew from others on the boat, becoming an island unto themselves. Their love was obvious to everyone and accepted, but they found it difficult to be alone. They resented the tensions between their parents and Neil, yet found themselves unable to break the knot of secrecy that they felt was oppressing them all. Vagabond sailed on, the mood of a ship's company heavy, the paltry meals unvaried, sparsely seasoned, the stink of the fish steaks drying in the sun, the stiffness of clothes washed in salt water, the familiar grizzled faces and unkempt hair of one's fellow crewmen day after day, the constant surge, sway and smash of Vagabond, the constant hunger and the suspicion that others were somehow eating more, the depressing reports from the outside world of war, disease, starvation and violence spreading faster than they could escape them. All these oppressed them. Ollie, who usually spent an hour every day telling stories to Skippy, now puffed violently on his unlit pipe. Katia and Tony were lovers, then fought bitterly, then were lovers again. Lisa and Jim, like two beings from some other planet, moved gingerly among them, doing their work, then retreating to Jim's guitar, Lisa's diary, long whispered conversations on the foredeck. Neil, Frank and Jean, caught in a tense tangle that couldn't last, lived each day according to the rules of routine and decency, and then retired to loneliness. They sailed on. The squalls that hit them 4 days after leaving Great Abaco eased the water problem. To gather water, all the self-bailing cockpits were stoppered, and even the inflatable dinghy was brought up onto the foredeck and partially inflated to catch water. They gathered 2.5 gallons in the first 10-minute downward and close to 6 additional gallons in the 2 heavier showers that followed. After the squalls, the winds shifted to the south. The seas grew calmer and Vagabond began a long tack directly towards San Juan. With the weight reduced of both men and material, the ship's company had already shed almost 100 pounds. Vagabond began racing towards San Juan at almost 180 miles a day. A week after they left the Bahamas, when they were less than 80 miles northwest of San Juan, the outer world, the one they were trying to escape, the one they were trying to rejoin, paid them another visit. It was after 1 a.m. when a sudden glow lit the distant horizon ahead of them, bloomed briefly like a bright flower, and warned the watchers that man had again unleashed his madness on man. They reacted to this explosion over San Juan, not with terror, but with a kind of bewildered optimism. It seemed somehow so wrong, so unjust, that after fleeing for almost 3 weeks and over 2,000 miles, they should find ahead of them still more. They could feel no emotion except despair. Lisa and Jim on watch turned Vagabond off the wind to sail away from the explosion, Lisa going crisply to the winches to let out the sails, as if responding to this explosion were a normal part of their nautical duties. At Jim's call, Neil came hurriedly up on deck, saw the light, which was now astern of them, and went to the helm to check the course. Disorientated, he took a half-minute to realise it was probably San Juan that was hit. After calculating their approximate position, he ordered Jim to alter course back to the east. They would have about 2 hours before the tidal wave could reach them, but only then would they turn to run before it. Because of the immense depth of water, he guessed that the wave wouldn't be breaking, and would probably be less of a threat than the wave in the shallow Cheapspake. Meanwhile, they would head east towards the Virgin Islands. When Neil took out the transistor radio and tuned it to their usual station in San Juan, he found it was no longer broadcasting. The tidal wave overtook them in the early morning hours on schedule. A wave of a little less than 25 feet appeared among the 3-foot seas that had been running earlier. Frank was at the helm with Tony, Neil sleeping in the wheelhouse behind. They saw it almost at the last moment, a huge wall of water glistening in the light of the moon. Frank swung Vagabond away to run before it, but the gigantic unbreaking swell hit them in the aft quarter. Vagabond lurched violently, skidded along the wave at tremendous speed as she was carried like a toy for 40 or 50 feet, and then lurched again as she toppled to starboard at the crest, and the wave rolled under her like the back of a mammoth whale. The huge sea was followed by several other large waves in the 15 to 20 foot range, but by then Frank had swung Vagabond downwind, and she was running before them, surfing down their faces for half a minute and setting him to grin with incongruous acceleration at Vagabond's speed and grace under pressure. Neil awoke with a shout after the first smash and, groggy with sleep, began to shout out contradictory orders. But Frank, having survived the first awful wall of water, was not much concerned with vagabonds handling the puny little 15-footers. He just grinned at Neil and kept doing what he was doing. The sunrise followed morning showed them a terrible beauty. The whole southeast became a glowing sweep of bright reds and oranges, such as none of them had ever seen before. Already above them, high, dark clouds were spreading out across the sky, tinged now with the most delicate pink, but as the sun rose higher, shading to tarnish yellow, and then brown, then a brownish grey, and finally, and simply, to the all-pervading, thick, dull grey that they had so hated and feared over the cheap spake. By 9 a.m. San Juan was about 70 miles to the southwest. Sailing east, they were moving in the opposite direction from the high-altitude flow of radioactivity, which was westerly. Yet even sailing at 8 knots, they didn't gain on the expansion of the cloud. It spread outwards from its centre faster than they could flee. When the familiar, terrifying ash first appeared on their decks, Neil once again ordered everyone below and had Tony dress in foul-weather gear to sweep the decks clean. By the time he had finished just the first clean-up, he was collapsing from the heat and calling out weakly, had to be held down into the main cabin. Neil had developed a technique of steering Vagabond by compass from below, since the steering wheels passed down through the wheel at the rear of the main cabin, and could be pulled alternatively to adjust Vagabond's course. The decks could be swept down every 20 minutes or so by someone as well protected as Tony had been, but no one dressed for the Arctic had to be on deck to steer. By noon, 3 hours after the first trace of ash had been discovered, they were no longer able to see any evidence of additional fallout. The dark cloud was mostly west and south of them. Only a thin grey layer directly above. It was Captain Ollie who seemed most disturbed by the latest explosion. Neil discovered him late that afternoon sitting forward on the starboard hull, staring blankly out at the grey water to the southeast of them. Neil realised he must have been sitting there for hours. "What's happening, old fellow?" Neil asked, holding on to the stainless steel shroud for balance. Vagabond was rolling and plunging uncomfortably as she reached eastward into the southwesterly wind. "Feeling a little poorly," Ollie answered after a brief pause. "Your stomach?" Neil asked, concerned about radiation sickness. "My heart," said Ollie. "My God, what's the matter?" "Not that heart," said Ollie irritably. I mean, that dust gets me down. I know. I don't mind explosions or tidal waves or fires or big winds. The sailors are meant to have to deal with those. But when it rains death, how do you reef for that?" Neil didn't answer. They stared out at what seemed to be an ugly grey sea beneath the cloud bank to the south. "And the ocean," Ollie went on in a low voice. "For 50 years I've been figuring that no matter how much man ruined the land, the one thing he'd never destroy, no matter how hard he tried, and I knew he'd try his damnedest, would be the sea." Neil let the silence hang briefly and then said softly, "It's not destroyed yet." Captain Ollie removed the perpetually unlit and empty pipe from his mouth and tapped it idly on the deck. "No," he said after a while, "it ain't. But I seem to have underrated man's talent for making a mess of things. All these years I've been depending too much on man's weakness and stupidity. I figured he was just too dumb to mess things up totally." He looked up at Neil, his grizzled face and red eyes looking tired and old. "I just pray the Lord God will save us from man's intelligence." Neil looked at him for a long moment and nodded. "Amen," he said.